Donald Trump is Vladimir Putin's puppet. This is not some wild theory or a crazed conspiracy. It's clear and plain fact. And the terms of the ceasefire agreement that Putin and Trump just came to on their call is all the evidence you need for it. Because after Russian state TV claimed that Donald Trump was quite literally using Kremlin talking points when discussing Ukraine and attacking President Zelensky, we have an even closer look into exactly how he was essentially instructed by Russia on what to give up. Donald Trump will try to claim this ceasefire as some massive win for peace and his ability to negotiate, but what it actually is a knifing of our ally in Ukraine at the exact direction of Putin. And we know that because of a breaking leaked report from a Kremlin think tank that we are going to get into. But before we do, if I can quickly ask you to leave a like on this video, and if you haven't already and you enjoy our channel, to hit that subscribe button. It goes a long way and it really does mean a lot to me. Now, before we can get into that leaked report, I want to hear a little bit more on the terms of this agreement from the folks at MSNBC right here.
It was emphasized that the key condition for preventing the escalation of the conflict and working toward its resolution by political and diplomatic means should be the complete cessation of foreign military aid and the provision of intelligence information to Kyiv. But maybe you've had a chance to read the entire thing, which I'm only about halfway through.
Yeah, I'm still picking through it myself, Chris. It's been translated from Russian. One thing I will tell you, just for viewers to know, and you know, the viewers will understand that we're still making sense of this, is that the Kremlin readout and the White House readout is different. So they haven't kind of agreed a joint statement. They've put out their different interpretations of what's been said. I will say that as far as we can tell from the Kremlin readout, it does not include a mention of the Black Sea. So one of the points I would make here is that I think that this is still negotiations in progress. So a week ago, the Ukrainians appeared to agree to, well, they agreed to a 30-day ceasefire, you know, punctuation point, nothing more. Here you have a negotiation between the US and the Russians about all kinds of things, not simply a ceasefire. Now, what the Kremlin does say, and I'll just read this piece because, as Garrett suggested, this is important. During the conversation, Donald Trump put forward a proposal for the parties to the conflict to mutually refrain from striking energy infrastructure facilities for 30 days. Vladimir Putin responded positively to this initiative and immediately gave the Russian military the corresponding order. So it appears right now the Russians have agreed to and are implementing a 30-day ceasefire in respect of energy infrastructure facilities. Simply that. Now, there is a lot more to this Russian readout, including a lot about prisoner exchanges and the Russians handing over Ukrainian prisoners, for example. And it is kind of described, or it is portrayed in this Russian readout as the Russians, you know, offering compromise in a sense. But there isn't really much compromise in this beyond that. And as you mentioned, this question of whether the US is agreeing to restrict support for Ukraine during this ceasefire, that will be deeply controversial because, okay, after the ceasefire, what happens? What kind of negotiation is there during the ceasefire over what kind of support Ukraine might get? And, of course, one of President Putin's long-standing aims has been to ensure that Ukraine is neutral, and Ukrainians would say to neutralize the country. So that would appear to be a concession to the Russians. There's another point in here which I didn't hear. I haven't seen the Washington readout, but I didn't hear, Chris, in what you were sharing with viewers. The Russian readout talks a lot about normalization, which translates as you know, removing sanctions, rebuilding economic ties, the kind of things that the Russians really want. One last point, Chris, in this Russian readout, which you know, kind of gets your attention, although it may seem fairly small compared with the others. It says Donald Trump supported Vladimir Putin's idea to organize hockey matches in the US and Russia between Russian and American players playing in the NHL and the KHL.
All right, so let me go back to you, if I can, Garrett. The look on your face may say everything about hockey, but on the bigger picture, clearly these are two very different statements and no decisions. That there's no clarity on any agreement here.
Well, look, I think there are a couple of points. On the idea of the 30-day ceasefire against energy infrastructure, that does seem to be the big key deliverable point that is, at least in principle, agreed on in both statements. The Kremlin statement goes farther than does the White House statement. The Kremlin statement does also mention President Putin, it says, responding favorably to President Trump talking about this peace or security initiative related to the Black Sea. So there's at least an acknowledgement that that was a topic that came up.
Donald Trump will try to laud this as some win for his ability to negotiate, his status as a peacemaker around the globe while he tries to go to war with Panama and Canada. But that's not true. Donald Trump continued to hurt and weaken the negotiating position of our allies in Ukraine throughout this whole discussion about a ceasefire, and that is ultimately concluded with them being in a worse position than when they started during the Biden presidency. And that is because of Donald Trump, and that was all architected out from the beginning. And we can see that in this report right here. Document for Russian leaders outlines plan to prolong Ukraine war by creating Trump tensions. A document prepared for the Kremlin by a Moscow-based think tank states a peaceful resolution to the Ukraine war cannot happen before 2026. The document drawn up in February outlines the Russian plan to weaken the U.S. position on the Ukraine crisis by boosting tensions between the Trump White House and other nations as Russia moves ahead with its plans to pick apart the country. The document, obtained by a European intelligence agency and reviewed by the Post, argues that the current Ukrainian government needs to be fully dismantled. The current Kyiv regime cannot be changed from inside the country. Its complete dismantling is needed, the report states. The think tank behind the document has close connections to the Russian Federal Security Service, which is in charge of Russian operations in the war-torn country and pushes extreme demands for a peace deal, stating that Donald Trump's plan to reach a peace agreement within 100 days is impossible. The plan also rejects any notion that peacekeepers will be allowed in Ukraine, as several European leaders have suggested. In addition, the document insists on recognition of Russian sovereignty over the territory it has seized in Ukraine. He noted they consistently talk about the root causes, which are about the domestic politics in Ukraine, and even more important than that, the European security architecture, which would be the role of NATO. A simple ceasefire which doesn't take that into account is of no interest to Russia, and Trump doesn't appear to understand. A Kremlin spokesperson told the newspaper that the Russian government was not aware of such recommendations outlined in the document. So from what we heard on what the terms of this agreement are, it is clear that Donald Trump will be falling in line with all of the demands of Putin to recognize the land that has been claimed by Russia in this war unlawfully, to not keep any of the aid that we have been sending to Ukraine, to not allow them to access our security information. That will all be cut off as Donald Trump looks to weaken the Ukrainian position so Putin can return years from now, a year from now, 30 days from now, whatever it may be. Donald Trump wants to cut off support. He wants to stop any further involvement with NATO, and he wants to leave Ukraine stranded and struggling after recognizing Russian sovereignty in the land that it has stolen from the Ukrainian people. That is Donald Trump's plan, and it was the plan outlined by Putin. This is not a peace deal. This is the first step in greater escalation of the conflict in a way that leaves Ukraine much weaker than it was before. This is so Donald Trump can parade around with a fake win when in reality, we know he's just helping Putin. He has been completely played, or he is just voluntarily helping Putin, which is likely the outcome, and essentially what Mark Kelly predicted and warned against when he was asked about what a potential agreement should look like just a couple of days ago.
Now we're back to a good place, and I hope that we can get the Russians to agree to this. We don't know if they will, but I think folks need to keep in mind that they have broken ceasefires before. And we're going to have to hold them to it. So there should be provisions in there for us to do that.
Does it help strengthen Ukraine's hand, which I know you've been worried about, since they did restart the sharing intelligence and also the military weapons as well, the military aid?
Does it strengthen their hand? I think it does now, but they lost something over these days. So right when I was there, we talked about, I met with F-16 pilots, and they didn't have the overhead imagery that they need. They didn't have the entire picture of certain things that are very important when you're planning a strike. That was taken away from them. There were, because of intelligence that they did not have, it was harder for them to react to ballistic and cruise missile attacks. So those things have an impact. We don't know for sure if additional Ukrainians died because of this, but it is possible.
Yeah. The one thing with this happening in the movement here, and I know one thing you'd been concerned about is Ukraine having to give up land. Secretary Rubio said that realistically they do believe Ukraine will have to give up. It will go to pre-2014 borders when Russia went into Crimea and illegally annexed it. But on this situation overall, Trump has argued that you have to at least talk to Putin to try to get to the table here. Do you believe that that is helpful, given there weren't conversations between Biden and President Putin after Russia invaded?
Well, of course, at some point you have to talk to him. But I always think we should want to negotiate from a position of strength, not weakness. Giving stuff up early just shows that we're weak. I think the president thought he was, showing some strength when they were in the Oval Office bullying Zelensky. That was not productive. That's not who we are as a country. This stuff should not be done in front of a camera. But I think right where we are right now, I think Mike Waltz and Marco Rubio made some progress. Let's try to continue the progress. Let's not blow things up again. Let's not go back and I mean, who knows what could happen, but we don't need to stop the weapons support and the intelligence. That would be a mistake to go down that road again. I mean, you see this with tariffs, right?
Yeah.
Bouncing back and forth all over the place. Let's be consistent.
It is no shock that this is the place that we have landed, where Donald Trump is helping Putin and eventually setting him up for a larger invasion of Eastern Europe down the line. That is what Donald Trump ultimately wants to do, is to abandon our allies and claim it to be peace, when in fact we know what he is actually having as his end goal, to serve Putin in whatever way is possible. And there was the mention of the Russian and American hockey games. Donald Trump wants to pretend like this is the end of any tensions between America and Russia, and we are now all friends again. He is trying to change the narrative. He is trying to pretend that a peace deal has been brought. That is not what this is, and it's clear who's running the show. It's Vladimir Putin, and that is incredibly scary. And we cannot allow him to get away with a narrative that this is some big win, because it's not. This leaked document shows what actually happened here, and we have to call it out. We're certainly going to on the show every single day. And if you want to support that, as always, you can hit that subscribe button. You can leave a like on this video. And if you stuck around to the end, you can drop a blue heart in the comments. And until next time, I'll see you soon.